We're going to show you how to take this and turn it into this. You are either one of two people. You're the guy or girl who says, why so much body filler? Or why does my car have phantom waves at the car show? The first thing you're going to have to do is master metal finishing. In this video, we're going to go into showing you how to rearrange the metal to where you're not going to have excessive filler and a lot better finish that holds out. The first thing you're going to want to do is take the damage that you have and start manipulating it back into the orientation that it needs to be in before you can minimize how much damage and stretch has been put into a panel. Everybody's project's going to have a different level of damage, and we're trying to give you guys the full spectrum from creases to ball peen hammers where we've stretched this panel. Now, although this panel is the finished product, we want to give you guys the full demonstration of a step-by-step of how to get your panel back to the shape that it originated in. In doing so, we are going to be a little bit barbaric to remove the creases and cold shrink in the metal in on itself to the toe dolly. And at that point, you're going to use a blue Dicam spray out fluid so you can then locate where your highs and where your lows are so you can finesse every bit of these steps to get this finish. We put blue Dicam layout fluid on this panel so we can use an acrylic next level block with 120 grit sandpaper to graze over the top and see where we have the areas that are stretched. That is just to give you a little bit more of a visual than only relying on a straight edge. In this case, we're just using a spring steel spreader to see where our highs and our lows are. And we have already manipulated this back into the orientation that we want it to be in, which is flat. What you need to know is if you are trying to repair a flat panel, you need to be using a flat toe dolly. And this needs to be perfectly flat in order to get that back to a mirror finish. The other portion of that is your hammer. If your hammer is not ground to where it has a very slight radius, a low crown hammer, and it's just dead flat, every time you smack that, you're putting a circle into your panel and causing more damage. With this being a very low crown hammer, you can then strike the toe dolly and cold shrink these back into themselves. What's happening as you do this is you are taking the metal that is stretched and ballooned up and you are forcing it in on itself, cold shrinking. You're not using any heat at this point, so you're just forcing it in on itself. And now we are going to work out the areas that are just uneven and stretched and normal. If we're paying attention to the sound that we hear, every area that is ballooned up and is not flat with the toe dolly, you are still cold shrinking. If you are hearing a ping, hammer on dolly, and it's making contact, at that point you are stretching and displacing the metal to where you're going to have more shrinking to do later. The goal here is we are just trying to tap down. It is a finesse and a feel and listening to every single hammer strike be cold shrinking only. Try to iron out the majority of your areas that are not flat. And if you go at it too aggressively, you're going to have more damage at the end. Just try to focus on the areas that are excessive first. As you start to get it back flat and in the orientation that you need, you're going to constantly jump back and forth with your block to see what you have. Any areas that are registering high, we're going to tap those back down flat. If you have an area that is a little bit on the low side, then you're going to want to switch to a dolly that has a very slight crown to it. That's going to allow you to bring the area that is low up. The number one common thing I see in the classes that we teach is that people see a low, call it a crater, and they put the dolly and they force upward in the center of that low, and they tap the perimeter around the dolly trying to push the low up. And although that works to move metal in any one direction, it's not actually displacing any metal. Where here, we know we have damage that is stretched, and we have to bring that metal back up into the orientation that we need. Now, I know this panel is flat, but in order to bring up those little tiny highs, we put a little small crown to just tap it. Obviously, the harder that we hit it, the more it's going to displace and the more it's going to stretch upward. So this is where it becomes this balance of how hard do you hit it and where do you hit it? Are you hitting it off the dolly? If you're hitting it off the dolly, you're moving the metal around ever so slightly versus actually hitting it hammer on dolly and making contact, hearing the ping and stretching the metal upward, moving it. Different dollies may be a little bit more comfortable. It might fit in a panel a little bit better than others. I always like the railroad dolly, as I call it, because it has a nice feel. It has a very low crown to it, similar to what the tow dolly has, but I can hold it better. It feels more comfortable, and you need to have the panel or the door, whatever it is you're working on, nice and firmly bolted down and rigid, clamped. A lot of what we are going to be discussing here was learned from, in my opinion, the best, which is Ken Sakamoto. Ken Sakamoto teaches metal finishing classes specifically on this in Pasadena, California. If you guys look up Sun Chaser metal finishing or Sun Chaser shrinking discs, that is Ken. I would reach out to him. I'm sure we'll have a link in the description so that way you guys can find his information. But that is where we learned these techniques. So this is a very basic rundown of what is entailed, but if you really want to master what a metal finisher can do, you need to take Ken's class to fully understand this. This is going to get you guys moving in the direction that you want to go, but to refine it, that is where you guys need to head. At this point, we've ironed out the majority of this corner where we bent it over and hit it with a sledgehammer. Well, we know when we bent it over and hit it with the sledge that we stretched that crease out. So we have a lot of stretch in the area of the crease. And what we're doing is we are lining up this low crown. So if I have a crease that is a low spot, we have the dicom showing every little tiny low at this point. And because it's worked out for the majority, we are just picking at those lower areas to bring up. So if we want to paint a picture here, put the dolly directly in the area that is low underneath, forcing upward with firm pressure, and you're going to be taking a low crown hammer and lining it up with the area that you want to bring up. It seems contrary because you're putting the hammer in the area that is low, and we are just taking the areas that are dark blue and the lowest of these little small areas, and we are just picking them up. Right now we're trying to get the majority of those stretched areas brought back up by putting it into the curvature of the dolly. Now I know this has a low crown and this is a flat panel. We're going to get into the refinishing of this with the shrinking disc later in the video, but we're just trying to pick every one of these little dark spots and get them brought back up and smooth to like 90% completed, so where the shrinking disc has very little work to do. We're using a hammer to pick away at these little areas, and when it becomes very, very minute, we will then switch to a slapper where you're bridging the highs and you are just making little taps to bring up those tiny little areas one little bit at a time. We jump around to get everything close, and as you get it farther and farther along, you're going to just stay in the area so that way these scratch marks are pretty much scuffing all the way through, with the exception of a very little amount of areas that are high. What we can also do is we can wash over this with the shrinking disc to just take out some of the excessive stretch, which is probably what I'm going to do here, and then we will come back in and iron this out a little bit more. This is Ken Sakamoto shrinking disc. It is a serrated stainless steel shrinking disc on a 6,000 RPM Makita grinder. If you're using a buffer that's only doing 2,500 RPM, it's not going to create the heat that you need to do this efficiently. Ken goes into very great depths about how this shrinking disc works, but all you need to know for the basics to get started is that this stainless steel disc is rubbing on any area that is even a little bit high. The reason that this is so much better than, say, heat shrinking with a torch is most people don't even know where they're putting the torch and why they're putting it there. If you're using a block to locate your highs, then you can take the shrinking disc and just rub that high. The bigger the high, the more heat that it's going to take to shrink. And that's why we try to iron this out as best we can with the Hammer and Dolly, so we're only taking out a little tiny bit of stretch at that point. By cold shrinking, we're taking a lot of the stretch out, and then by using the shrinking disc, we are just dialing that panel. Precision shrinking is the best way to think about this. If you're using a torch, you have no way of gauging how long and how much heat did you put into that panel. This, you're learning the art of how much pressure, how much are you just barely rubbing the surface, and the better the panel gets, the lighter and more technique it takes. But right now we are going to use this because we have the majority of the panel shrunk down with the Hammer and Dolly, and we do have a level of oil canning because that metal is not shrunk back down perfect. It has to have somewhere to go, and that's why you get oil can. 9 times out of 10, if you have an oil can, the panel is almost fixed and almost relaxed because it is in that relaxed state where it will oil can go back up and down. That's where a panel is loose. And if you have a door or you're trying to get to the back access, sometimes that requires removing the inner structure or taking the panel off and being able to flip it up and down so that way you can take care of the stretch. Like right now, you guys can see all the areas that are high, and we can take the clamps off and flip this over and also touch on the areas that are high on the backside. I see a lot of people doing heat shrinking and they think that the wet rag is what's actually shrinking it. But what you have to understand is that the heat is what is shrinking it. You're heating it up, the molecules in the metal are rising, and when you stop the shrink with the rag is not actually what shrinks the molecules. The heat, as it cools, the molecules shrink back down together, lowering these areas. So you want to give it a good 10 to 15 second count, because if you have a high, you have something that is excessively stretched, and if it's more stretched in the middle, you want that heat to dissipate out ever so slightly. Technically, you can heat shrink something and not have to worry about rushing to a rag to give it a quick swipe and let it cool down. The goal here is that you are trying to understand what needs to happen to reverse the damage. We already know we damaged this with a hammer and we stretched the piss out of the panel. So don't worry about having to, if you guys are using a torch, then maybe you're trying to heat shrink something that's really large, a lot of area. But if you're just trying to take out a little bit of damage, a shrinking disc can accurately pinpoint exactly where those areas are when you're using a good block. What we're going to do, we have just taken some of the shrink or some of the little bit of highs out of this side. I'm going to flip the panel over so we can see the other side. When we put the panel on the flat table, we can see that it is rocking and this is the high side. So because of all of the stretch that happened, I want to just run over this area to just take out a little bit of that stretch that has happened. If you're running the shrinking disc over this area and you are running the disc into the areas that are not affected, you are going to shrink the areas of that sheet metal that's already good and not affected and make them thicker by shrinking them. So you're causing more of a wave or a ripple, and that's going to cause the phantom wave. We're trying to get this panel back uniform and completely back to the shape that it originated in, and that's what's going to eliminate you guys from having those phantom waves. Doesn't matter. I think a lot of guys are going to hear, well, if you're metal finishing it, then you don't even need filler. Well, that's partially correct. You're still going to be using a level of filler, whether it's in primer, maybe it's in polyester, because you still have to get the car aligned straight. Even if you metal finish every single panel on the car, there is a level of body filler because we're talking about making it a mirror from headlights to taillights. And none of these panels, especially on old cars, fit that good. So a lot of times it still requires a skim coat to get the panels from one to the other to align perfectly. But if each panel is nice and relaxed and perfect, you're going to eliminate having those issues that when the sun comes in, you have a different thickness of metal, you have a different thickness of filler, whether it's primers or body filler, and that is going to cause those phantom waves. Give it a good 10 to 15 second count before we wipe over it with the rag. You can still feel that the panel is warm. We want to let this cool. You can already see that little tiny bit of rubbing over this with the shrink disc is starting to relax the panel, and it's taking out more and more of this damage. As you basically work the panel to get it back into the shape that it needs to be in, little by little, sometimes you need to just run over the disc real quick to take out that little bit, and then you can go back to hammer and dolling and ironing out those other little issues. We're also trying to work the panel back flat, and I have this ironed out pretty close, but we still have those big 3 knots where you can see the center that was cold shrunk down created this circle like a crater, and that's what we have to take the hammer and dolly and work that out just smooth. You take the majority of that big stretch that happened from the ball peen, and when you push it down, it has an area around it that we just have to dial in. A lot of times that's where I will grab a very low crown dolly and I will just work out that crater to where it's a very low smooth crown, and then the shrinking disc will take the last 10% and just make it dead flat. Right now, I can't really check this corner until I get the majority of the stretch that has happened in the center of this panel to lay back down flat. So I'm going to pivot to the next area and just get this panel. If I know this is the least amount of work, I'm going to get this area relaxed and flat, and then I'm going to come back to this corner and just dial it in. All right. If we're comparing the three right now, we've worked out slowly the two, and you can see that the block is now making that a gradual radius to the panel. We're going to take out that little tiny bit of radius with the shrink disc, but it's a very clear representation if you're comparing these two to the one. We are putting this directly in that low and hitting in the low to stretch up that area that is down. If you're struggling to figure out where your hammer on dolly is actually located, I want you guys to have really good lighting. Lighting that is, this works that being overhead for shooting this video, but if you put a light farther down closer to your panel, you will be able to see the surface area of your panel. Every hammer strike that you make into the sheet metal, you should see a very, very small 1/8 inch to 1/16 inch impression when that hammer touches on dolly. And if you can see that on the metal, especially with the blue Dicam fluid on there, you can pivot and make those very small adjustments with your dolly. If you're just tapping the sheet metal and you're not hearing the hammer on dolly, then you're not going to displace that metal in the area that you want. If you are tapping around and then you come across it, for example, let's just say I want to hit an area that is dark and I'm trying to find it. I'm going to locate the hammer over that area in the center, and I'm just going to tap. And if I don't hear the hammer on dolly, I can make small adjustments underneath with the dolly. And once you hear it, then you can see which direction you need to move. You can push the dolly in. I couldn't find it because the table is limiting me as to where it is, which if you're taking the time to locate exactly where you need to be, you might have to adjust your wooden buck that you're holding your door or your clamps on your table so you can get into that area accurately. Otherwise, you end up stretching an area that didn't need stretch to begin with, and then you're causing more work than you initially started with. Don't think you're going to just jump into this and just start hammer and dollying willy-nilly. You need to make, we talk often when we do our bodywork videos, every pass counts, every hammer strike counts. So every one of them, you should know exactly where you are hitting and be precision with your hammer and dolly work. It's going to reflect the end result and you're not going to have as much struggles. Even though this is a very basic video on how to do this, there is thousands of hours that I have in practicing this to actually get decent at it. And I'm trying to remember all these little nuances for you guys of things that helped me in that path. Now we have the majority of the big stretch that happened with the ball peen ironed out with just the hammer and dolly. But you can see we still have a very low crown. Very low crown. So what we're going to do is we can see our highs because we blocked it with our Dicam. And if you guys want a visual, you can see that our straight edge is rocking in those three areas. Now I'm going to focus that shrink disc to only be rubbing. Every pass counts with the hammer and dolly, every pass counts with the shrinking disc. Only rub the areas that are high and start slow. Give it just the weight of the grinder itself and just run over it slightly. And when you do that, put the grinder down and try to feel it. Get an idea of how much heat you have in that panel, how much pressure. This is an art, and you really need to become in tune with every movement that you make. You are accurately bringing the metal back down into the state that you started with. The struggles that I had when learning this was understanding how detailed do you have to be with the placement of this shrinking disc. If you guys have this down on the panel and the shrinking disc is at a slight angle, and I mean we're talking 5-10 degrees different on how that panel feels. If you have the shrinking disc running at an angle, I see a lot of guys doing this, then your shrinking disc is only hitting directly in the center. I want you guys to pretend that this shrinking disc is your acrylic block, and you want to be rubbing that disc over your high right through this area as if it's a block. So if this is a curve, you're going to be rubbing and moving the grinder with the curve of the panel. Or if it's flat, you're going to be setting that down there as flat as you can and making small movements. By making those adjustments and creating that heat slowly, you can creep up on it instead of going the opposite direction. Because if your panel is almost perfect and you implemented too much pressure or too much angle, you just shrunk that past the area that was flat, and now you have something that goes down concave, and you're going to have oil canning to where you have to work that back out. Don't think you can just sit there and keep flipping the panel. You have to have the panel relaxed and flat. If you sit there and just flip back and forth, I've done that too, it just keeps shrinking that spot, and eventually your panel just ends up as a potato chip. So we're going to come in very lightly and just slowly work this and watch it come down onto the panel. If you have a low crown panel, you want to have a very small air gap at the tip of your shrinking disc as you go over the curve. That way you know you're hitting in the right zone on the flattest surface of the shrinking disc that you can get to. Again, 10-15 second count. As the panel's cooling, I want to emphasize again that if you are running this shrinking disc more aggressively, I think when you hear these basics, you just jump into it. I did. And I would use the shrinking disc because you see what it's capable of, but you don't really realize how precise it can be. Well, if over here has nothing affected to it and the panel is the right shape, it may not be the right shape right now, because if I block this, I show that this is high and this is hitting, but I don't show anything here. I know this panel was flat. Maybe you're using a contour gauge from one fender to the other side, but you need to know what shape you have. A lot of times I use splines from Melomotive so I can put that flat edge on the curve or the flat, and I can see what shape that I need to be in. Don't get tunnel vision to where you're working one area and you're overworking the metal, and that shrinking disc is touching in areas that it does not need to be touching in, because it will start creating very small ripples in the panel. And then it just becomes this vicious battle because you think you're getting it straight, you re-dicom it and you re-block it, and then you go, that's not as straight as I thought it was. Every time you shrink, you block. Every time you hammer and dolly, you block. Because these highs and lows are going to change with every one of those movements. You could do 2 or 3 hammer strikes and you're moving the metal in just those couple strikes. So check it. Be accurate with it. We can see right now that these 3 were the only 3 that were hitting initially, and as we bring this down, you're going to see us start to see more surface area with our block. Clamping this panel to the flat table, we have the ability to feel how firm that panel is. If it has a lot of stretch in it, it's going to have a lot of strength. This is removing those highs, which is removing the strength, and it's going to get more and more relaxed the better that it gets. When you heat that with the disc, it gives you a little bit of a false representation of what you have, because that panel is heating up and creating a bigger crown. And then as it cools, if you have a small crown, when you heat it, it's going to rise up a little bit. And as it cools, it's going to shrink just below where you started, dependent on how much heat and pressure that you put on it. And just that couple passes, this panel is moving a little bit more freely. I'm going to block it again. If we know this is where the shrinking disc was rubbing flat on these crowns, we have to constantly check it. And it is starting to hit in more and more areas. As you're becoming in tune with your shrinking disc, the serrations actually create a very high pitched, and it probably is not going to show up on your TV or for you guys watching, but when you are on the high, it is going to make a very high pitch. You want to stay in that zone, because if you're not hearing the high pitch, you are shrinking areas that are not stretched. You want to give this enough time to slowly creep up on things. You need to have enough patience to be able to do metal finishing. And if you don't have enough patience, like I did, it will teach you what patience truly is. So don't get frustrated. A lot of the guys that I have taken Ken's class with, we often communicate back and forth. And the number one thing that we all do is we spend so many hours at this that you get exhausted and you start going in a direction that you forgot the basics. This video is intended to just be the basics so you can have something to relate to. One of the examples is a friend of mine, Jesse, was struggling with a panel that he was hammer and dollying it, trying to bring it up. So let's think about the basics here. If our dolly is a low crown and we're hammer on dolly and we're trying to bring that area that was a little bit low up, but it just continually goes down, something that we've learned, and I'm sure Ken taught it, but you're only going to grasp how much information that you can get dependent on what your knowledge is with that at that time. If it's very green, then you're not going to even understand some of these small tips. But if your hammer has more of a crown, I don't know if this will show up, this hammer versus this hammer has way more radius to it than this one. And if your hammer has more radius than your dolly, then it will go in that direction. So if this has more crown, it's going to go up. If this has more crown, it's going to go down. Always, it's the little things that help keep you on track. Look how good this panel is sitting. It barely has any deflection here. We're going to take our block and check it. We have a lot more area showing. As we get closer to flat, we need to give it lighter pressure, a little bit more finesse, and try to just stay on those areas that are a little tiny bit high. That is where a lot of mistakes that I made learning this was I would just be a little bit too aggressive. I was a bull in a china shop, and I would get in there and I would push and think I was doing good, and then right at the last 10%, the panel would go the other direction, and it was very frustrating. So have that patience. I can't stress it enough. Make sure this shrinking disc slows down and you take your time turning it over, because this thing will open you up and it could be very dangerous. Again, it goes back to taking your time, understanding exactly what you're doing. The other thing that this is relatable to is If we know what happens when we heat something, we have other videos where we have metal finishing out a TIG weld. Doesn't really matter if it's a TIG weld, MIG weld, we're creating heat. When we create heat, it shrinks. Basics. If you welded a panel up and it shrinks, you have to stretch that back out. You are constantly thinking and evaluating what panel you have. Maybe you're picking up a car from somebody and it already has the damage there, which is most times the case. But maybe you're making the patch panels and you're chasing an area that is low or high, but before you welded it, it was already perfect. Just understand that if the panel was good when you started and you welded it, it shrunk into that weld and pulled the metal in. Hammer and dolly on the weld seam and it will stretch it right back out. But again, it is a finesse. How much heat did you take to weld it? Is your welding proficient? How much hammer and dolly work or planishing with a planishing hammer do you have to put into it? It depends on how good your welding is. It's not a very simple answer. It is strictly, if you heat anything, it's going to cause shrink. We've talked about if you know what the damage is. How do you know if the damage, or how do you address this if you don't know what the damage is? I kind of touched on what the splines were. You need to be checking the curvature of the panel. So if you're doing a 61 Impala that's really flat, that curve is going to be very minimal. But if you're using something like this to check every bit of the car, you might end up off track. The other thing to consider is if the metal is smooth, then there's not much damage. But if the metal has a whole bunch of rippliness to it, then you know there's some excessive damage there. All you have to do is use the Dicom layout fluid and run a block over it. If we're using a bigger spline to check it, maybe initially you use a bigger block longer. 2 feet's about all you need in distance. That way you can just lightly rub over the area and it will show you where your highs and where your lows are. So just find out where your points of contact are, and if you can see the damage is all wrinkly and looks like a walnut shell, then you need to work those areas out. If the area is smooth, there's a lot of times that you can do what they call bumping. Bumping is where you basically take a dolly and you are just exactly what it says. You are bumping the back of the panel ever so slightly, and you would be surprised how much movement you get in, say, a big quarter panel. When we did the 61 Impala and we're still working on it, we checked the majority of the damage was up at the front near the door, and the back of the car, it was smooth, but there wasn't the same amount of damage. We were able to get it roughed out with just the dolly and bumping things to where we could block or check with a straight edge and get those things to where they're tracking. At that point, you can just work up the little bits of highs and lows with the hammer and dolly or the slapper and the dolly. So you just have to kind of play Inspector Gadget with your project and give it yourself the best examination that you can give it with what you know. Does it look damaged? Does it look stretched? Or does it look like it's just a push dent that you can just bump out? Make whatever determination that you want. And I don't want to stress this enough. There are guys that are going to see this video and they're going to think that their car has to be metal finished. This is for the nitty-gritty and perfect finishes when we're talking about these phantom waves. Maybe it's for you, maybe it's not. It's not for everybody. It's not an absolute necessity, but it does make a high quality vehicle finish when you are done if you don't have those phantom waves. Again, most shops are not going to go to this level. It's very few, and we're just trying to bring back some of the quality and craftsmanship in the process that a lot of guys don't share, and also promote the guys that we do care about, like Ken, to show you guys the details that goes into this. We have got this really, really close. We're just taking our small straight edge and we are looking at where we have our rocking. We're relying on our block to show us exactly where our highs are. And we still have just a tiny little bit of stretch in those 3 areas that we're just slowly creeping up on. As you get closer and closer, the shine that you get from the stainless steel shrinking disc should start looking much, much more uniform. And as you create that tiny little bit of heat over the panel and you start moving, as long as you're paying attention to staying on the highs and don't get aggressive with it, it will really start to just take away all of the blue dicom into where you have a perfectly finished panel. We gave it our little count, give it a wipe. You are stopping the shrink, creating the shrink. Know the difference. And we smacked that thing where this thing was really rocking. And now we're talking about, there is like right there from the top out here to the flat, there's no air gap there, maybe a sheet of paper. If you guys want to know how much damage you have, take a sheet of paper and try to slide it underneath, and that will start dialing in how much or how good your metal finishing is. I still have a little tiny rock right here. A little tiny rock in that one. Let's talk about the cooling of the rag. Give yourself 10 to 15 seconds from the time you let up on the shrinking disc to take your time, put that down nice and safe, and just get this thing nice and wet. I wring it out to where it's just damp and just give it a good swipe over. For this video, we're working a small area. We're just giving it a wipe and then let it cool nice and even. If you just constantly are doing this, you are stopping the shrink uneven. If you're using an air nozzle, again, you are stopping the shrink unevenly. You're putting a focused amount of air in one area or the other, and that's going to cause an uneven stop in the shrink that you did do evenly. So here, we're almost there. But I do find that it is important to take your time with letting it cool, making sure that the panel does not have any warmth to it. Where our high was before was clear over here, and now our high point is here. The amount of stretch that you have in your panel is going to be uneven, so as those become corrected, those areas that are high are going to move, and that's where you need to move with your shrinking disc to make sure you're only hitting on those highs. There we are. We've gotten this to the point where we're talking about the thickness of a sheet of paper on flatness across this entire center area. So we want to go back now and address our corner that we have bent over and stretched. So we're going to flip this around, clamp the majority of that flat to the panel, and we're going to iron out this corner. I think before we do that, while it's up here on the flat, I'm gonna run that shrinking disc over the corner. Again, I'm gonna make sure that when I run this disc, the disc is not hitting anywhere over here. I've already corrected this side, and I want to only run it over the corner that is all stretched from the damage. As we bring this down and we shrink it, I used to, like I said before, use this shrinking disc a little bit more aggressively than I should have been. and I need to rely more on my hammer and dolly techniques before I get into this guy. I initially would run it over there to the point where that spot would be really dark and I was creating so much heat, it would create a brittle spot and or crack. I'm only running over this with a quick or light manner. I say quick, you want to go over it even and slow, but you don't want to create so much heat. If you have a high point that's so high that you have a dark black spot where you've created so much heat, you're probably going to run into problems. You need to be doing more hammer and dolly work before you get into the shrinking disc. Try to save the shrinking disc for the very last bit of metal that you need to move. Let's touch on oil canning. A lot of guys get oil canning and they freak out and they think it's the end of the world. This is technically what you're going to see when you get an oil can. If it is moving freely, you are almost fixed. If you have a bunch of damage, like say a bunch of ball peen marks, it has a lot of strength, it's not going to oil can. So change your thinking and don't freak out if you have oil canning. You just need to rub over the panel with a block, see where your areas are high and where your areas are low. It could be as small as a very small dent that is causing an oil can. The lower the crown, the flatter the panel. Say you're doing a 63 Lincoln. If that panel is very low and flat and you have one little ding in it, you just made that panel loose. But if you have, say, a 40 Ford fender with a lot of shape, you're not going to get the oil can because of the amount of shape that's in the panel. What I want you to really think about here, and we've touched on it in another video, the sandblast video, is that the reason that we don't sandblast any, or let me rephrase that, we don't use any media that is actually going to shot peen and stretch metal is because you are doing that over the entire surface. If your car is a Lincoln and you are blasting it, that is going to cause a ton of warpage and oil canning because you have done that unevenly. Is the panel have an inner structure? If the panel has an inner structure, you're not blasting the bottom side evenly because you're hitting the exterior sheet metal through that open hole not uniformly. So you are creating stretch, and because that stretch is happening at different areas differently, it's causing stretch in the panel that's causing that looseness and that warpage. But if you blast a very curvy panel like a 40 Ford fender, you're probably not going to see the amount of warpage that you're going to see in a flat panel. The biggest thing is that I don't want to say this to poo-poo people to sandblast. Sandblasting has its purpose. We use it all the time. But understanding what you blast and what you don't blast is the biggest thing that I want you guys to take away from this video, as well as metal finishing. Because what is a sand particle doing? The sand particle is your hammer, and it is hitting the panel and it is stretching it. Now, is your sandblaster really good? Does he understand what he's actually doing? Because if your nozzle for the blaster is here, it's going to create a lot of stretch and displacement in that metal. Is your pressure high? Are you at an angle? Now the sand particle or media is going to hit and skip away and not be quite as abrasive. These are all things that come into play with sheet metal work that a lot of restoration shops do not consider, or the guy at your home that just needs to get the car stripped fast. Strip the car with a strip disc and then come back and blast the floor pans and stuff like that. That doesn't matter. We're going to jump into, we flip this panel over, we have that little bit of oil can. I want to take out this tiny bit of excessiveness because we're on a flat table. Now obviously this table is not metal finished. The dollies are, you learn in Ken's class to correct the dollies with Dykem and seeing where their imperfections are. But when we have a panel that's this beat up, you can rough it out even on the flat table and force the metal down into the flat panel, cold shrinking, before we jump into heat shrinking. If there's a lot of little damage like this, the shrinking disc is not going to take all of that out. You've got to make that smooth, low smooth, so where the shrinking disc can do a minimal amount of work. It's not going to take a bunch of shrink out if it's got a lot of crown. So just smooth it out to where it's close and let the shrinking disc do the rest. Before we had the oil canning, it's hot right now, so it's stretched more. And as we get it closer and closer, this thing's gonna lay down dead flat. We do have a very small tear in this corner, and I'm going to try and stay away from it from the shrinking disc because I don't want it to catch that edge and tear it more or remove metal. But again, what would we have to do there to fix this perfectly? We'd have to weld that corner up. What happens when we weld? It shrinks. So you just weld it up, hammer and dolly that weld back out. Think about your pizza dough. It balls up and it shrinks, and you've got to hammer and dolly that pizza dough back flat and then continue this exact same process. But you can see now that it's cooling, we're having less and less. So I'm going to flip this over to the side we have the dicom. And I'm going to use the toe dolly to continue ironing it out. A technique of how you hold the hammer is it's pivoting off of two fingers, and you're locking your elbow and just moving your arm and your wrist to where the hammer is just tapping the metal. If you are moving your entire arm, you're not being controlled. We're locking our body with our dolly, and we are locking our arm, and we are just moving the hammer, letting the hammer do the work. If you're using your arm a lot, you're probably gonna wear out and run out of steam. All I'm trying to do here is just force down the areas that are a little bit excessive and stretched, and force them back down to themselves, cold shrinking. We've been bringing all this damage back to a smooth surface, and that's why you can see this edge is curving up towards me. And if the smoother that we can get it, the more that that smooth crown can be flipped over and just lightly rubbed until this thing tracks right back to flat. Feels pretty good. Let's see where we're at with the block. Now I'm going to use the railroad dolly to just sit here and pick away at all of the small black that's really damaged and bring and smooth those out. Even though these are the basics on a small piece of sheet metal, I want you guys to understand that when you're checking this and you're rolling into an area that's damaged, start on the area that is the best. So if the back of the car is perfect and the front of the car is damaged, start working out your damage with the least amount of movement that you need. Because if you can make all of that perfect in what's good and creep into the areas that are worse, you have a good understanding of what that shape needs to be. For example, if you use a spline and you are checking the curvature or the radius of, say, a fender, if you start working in the area that is damaged first, you are going to probably end up overworking the metal and creating a shape that is not there, because you have this transition from good metal into the bad. And you can kind of see right in here is just a bend. It's not shaped, it is formed. What does that mean? Form, you can just bend it right back with force. Shape, you cannot just bend it and recorrect it. So if you run the shrinking disc over an area that is formed and not shaped, then you're going to have to stretch that back out at some point. You need to work the areas that are good first, getting those perfected as best as you can. I would say take this video, practice, make it better than you did yesterday, and don't get hung up on a completely mirror finish, because I think that's what everybody does, and this is the only way, and it might hold your project up for a long time because you're trying to perfect this. Well, how much time do you really need to put into this? Whatever works for your project. Don't let this take over and this becomes a 10-year project. Just get the metal to where it's not oil canning and where you can work and move forward with your project. When you have this much damage in a corner and you have all this tiny little areas, I feel like it's good to go back and forth between a little bit of hammer and dolly work. I know it may seem like I'm just jumping around, but I'm actually watching each one of these little lows, and I am moving the dolly in alignment, and I am bringing each one of those little tiny lows up. But if you're asking yourself, I don't want phantom waves in my car at a car show, at what level do I have to metal finish this to not get phantom waves? I'm going to give the example of shaving a gas door, something simple. If you shave a gas door and you have the weld seam, and that weld seam is V'd in, and it has all of that thickness right there, and it's not relaxed, it's tight and bound up, and you body work that out, it's not a matter of if it's going to show, it's a matter of when it's going to show. It might look good when you paint it, but later on it's not going to look so good. It's going to start showing those ripples and those phantom waves. You just need to get the metal back to where it's firm and not loose and oil canning, because if you have an area that's extremely thicker than another, or a lot of damage versus another area, those areas are what are problematic to show up later in a phantom wave. Just get it to the point where it is relaxed and it's firm. If the panel is firm and it has strength, or if it's really loose, I'm going to go back to the Lincoln example here. If you're doing the trunk in a Lincoln, and that trunk of the lid, if you're pushing on it and it's really loose, well, how are you going to body work something that's so loose? You can't, because it has no rigidity there in the shape. Understanding shape and form is the biggest takeaway. You just have to get the panel back where the damage is as close as you can get it. It's trial and error for you guys when it comes to what's going to be a phantom wave, but just get the panel back relaxed and close. Sometimes it's as simple as a small repair that needs a quick run over with the shrinking disc to relax the panel. Right now, if we look at this panel, I'm not forcing it down. It is sitting here relaxed. I have this becoming smoother and smoother. The crease that we had in here was shoved over on itself, and then we smashed it with the sledgehammer, and that's where the majority of the stretch happened. Over here in the corner, it's not as damaged as it is right on the crease. And you can see that crease where the stretch happened is right where it rolls over. So I'm going to clamp this to the table so it doesn't take off on the corners here, and I'm going to slowly shrink this with the disc now to get this back down flat. We are going to rely on only rubbing the shrinking disc in the areas that are high. Yeah. As the heat has it expanded, look at how much more tension is in there. But as it cools, you're not going to see that tension stay back in the panel. Something that just came to mind, how do you block something to know where the high is if it's oil canning? If it means that you got to grab your wife, your buddy, your cousin, your dog to stick their paw in the door and hold that oil can out, then do it. and then slowly rub over that door, and it's going to show you right where the stretched area is. A lot of guys will go to block it to see, and it'll pop in. Just put something in there that's going to hold it out, so that way you can see where the damage is or where the stretch is. And it might even require putting a stick in there, just something to hold it firm. Maybe it's a sandbag, to where you can sometimes rub with the shrinking disc to take that out, and then you'll notice that the panel will start to relax. Now it's not near as firm as it was. And I can see that my area right now that's touching, even though this is moving, is still right here. So we're going to focus right here to bring this down. If you look at edge to edge, this one is sitting very flat, and this side has a lot more curvature to it. Well, it has more shape. It has more stretch in it, and we have to bring this side down to get this to relax that way. If you can see the surface area that's been gained here, we need to bring down this side to keep this down. As we work this, you guys might be thinking about your project, and you might ask yourself, well, I can't get a shrinking disc into that panel. Sometimes, depending on how bad the damage is, you might have to take all of the rosette welds out of that factory panel and remove that quarter or that fender and build yourself a buck to replace the or to remove the damage that is in that panel. It just depends on how bad the damage is, but it is very common that if you want a very high level finish, that you will have to probably remove a panel here and there, or remove a structure that is blocking it. If you have a door that maybe you have a small access panel, something like this might work really good for you. This is I believe it's a 4-inch shrinking disc. I think this was bought from Ray Chalene in Massachusetts, and I just put it onto a die grinder so I could get into small areas. Again, depending on the project, maybe it doesn't require a metal finished surface. I just want to get it majority out and relaxed. Sometimes this does the trick really nice. These discs that he sells have the radius corner, a little bit safer than that. And since we're talking about safety, because I know there's going to be somebody talking about it, I am trying to teach you guys in this video, but when you guys are doing it, please wear hearing protection and safety glasses. I don't want you guys to be deaf or can't see what you do, ending up at the eye doctor getting metal out of your eye. We are getting closer and closer. This is becoming a lot smoother. And the area that's hitting with the block is becoming a little bit more uniform. If you're asking yourself, man, is the metal becoming thinner? This is stainless steel, and the stainless steel is not removing metal. It is a friction system. The friction between the two is what's causing the heat. It's not a sanding disc removing metal. check out how the panel has this huge arc over here. Oh, it's because we added a whole bunch more heat over here and it shrunk and it's kicking that corner up. So right now as it's heated, it's already relaxing just one swipe of the water. We're pretty close to where we need to be. What I'm going to do at this point is I'm going to flip the panel over and check the side that we have Daikin to see what we got. Now, we've shrunk the other side, and what we have is we have a high and a low, and we are dialing those in together, okay? So I'm gonna flip the panel, clamp this side, and all of these tiny little highs that we have on this side, we're gonna reverse that and go back the other direction as well. I'm keeping the disc on this corner because I don't want to introduce any shrink over here that's already nice and flat. I want to just work on the damage. This is becoming really nice and smooth at this point. And when you want it to sit back dead flat, you've got to creep up on the area that needs to be fixed. Now you can see there's very little blue now at this stage. So I want to go back to my Hammer and Dolly and just pick at those onesie twosie little lows and smooth that out. When you get really close to having all of the Daikin not showing, I have found that when you have the right lighting and you are hitting right in that tiny little spot of blue that is low, the Daikin will actually disappear as you strike it right on where it needs to be. And at that point, you can make every hammer strike count to the point where you're just creating that very slow, smooth crown, working out all of the tiny little damage. If you're using called a bullseye pick hammer, where you're hitting it, you're just pushing the metal around. Yes, that works, but I find that with the shrink disc Hammer and Dolly, it just seems to work a little bit better and it's a little bit more precise. I have bullseye picks, which will show you guys what that is. This is a bullseye pick. And the reason that that is this is your target and you are picking it. So if you have a low here, I can put this hammer there and I can tap it. But yeah, depending on the pressure that you have upward, yes, you are stretching it because it's forcing the metal into the center of these forks. But sometimes, depending on how nice this is finished and how much your technique is, I think this is a great way. This is just a different way of moving the metal. When you're trying to iron out something smooth that a shrink disc can come in and tackle, this might move a little bit more than you want. It just depends on your technique. If we look at this, there's hardly any blue showing. We have worked out all the tiny little areas, and now we have just that little bit of stretch left in the panel. So I am going to focus on this corner now. Ooh, that's hot. If you hold the panel flat, this is the only spot that I have that's holding this panel up from coming down. So I'm going to shrink this area first. The number one struggle that I had in getting to this point was always learning the balance of when to stop hammer and dolly work and using the slapper versus going to the shrinking disc. I used to think that the shrinking disc was going to help bring up some of my lows, and it's not going to do that at all. The balance here is that you guys pick the dolly that is going to match the shape that you are trying to remove, and learn the techniques of how to move metal up and how to keep it controlled to where you don't have a ballooning area. If you have an area that is just ballooning out of control, you need to ease up on your hammer and dolly work and maybe start using some shrinking disc in between. Find the balance in dialing in these lows. For example, this one is flat. we are using a metal spreader to keep our area consistent across the panel. The cool part about the slapper is that if you have an area that is high on either side, it is bridging the gap of that shape, and it is moving metal at a lesser rate than, say, a hammer, because you are bridging the two highs. You are evening the metal out, and you are pinpointing, using the tip of the slapper to locate exactly where the dolly is, and then bridge the slapper over the two high points and not moving at that point. You are hitting it exactly in the center of the hammer on dolly, but you're using the slapper, and in doing so, you are bringing up that low ever so gradually. I did have the slapper initially ground where it had a very slight radius in this direction, and it didn't do the same effect. Ken was able to come in, and he real quick, because that's what he lives in, is metal finishing, was put the straight edge on here, and he chopped the end of my slapper off, and that fixed a majority of the issues. A lot of times we do these vicious cycles and we get frustrated because you are so stuck in that zone on that big of an area, and don't let it get the best of you. Dial back, maybe you walk away from it for a bit and come back to it. Do metal finishing practices in small chunks. Otherwise, it will just completely frustrate you. It is going back to basics sometimes and checking yourself to make sure that you don't get out of line. This panel, even we learn more stuff every single time that we do it and we talk about it. And that's what we try to really emphasize, is those small details in these videos that you guys can come back time and time again, practice it, and learn something new. So get out in your garage, give this a try, and let us know in the comments how it goes. And if you've been doing metal finishing, drop us a comment of where maybe that light bulb kicked on, and if you have something to add to this tutorial, please do so in the comments. I hope you guys liked it. Please share it, and we'll see you guys in the next video.